Again, here we go. The state. We're going to do a few more concepts that involve the state. The first is legitimacy. Okay, so we all know what legitimacy is in normal life, more or less, right? We know it when we see it. Why are we talking about it here? Legitimacy in political science references the extent to which a government or a state is legitimate. Okay. I don't know if that helps at all, right? It's kind of a weird term. Traditionally, does that state, does that government have the right to govern, to rule over its people? What can we think of that might reduce that right? I think political scientists now view legitimacy a little different than they originally did. For a long time, if you're a state, you're legitimate. You need to have some significant recognition by the citizens and approval of the citizens in order to be considered legitimate. But how do you judge that? How do you measure it? You need to be able to maintain a monopoly over the use of violence over the territory. You need to be able to maintain your borders. You need to be able to maintain law and order, that sort of thing. Under the traditional definitions of political scientists, countries as appalling as North Korea would probably be considered legitimate, because on some level they're recognized, their legitimacy or their right to rule is recognized by individuals, by the people. But I think nowadays political scientists are much more likely to say, hey, no, North Korea is not legitimate in any sense. That legitimacy involves a much more robust level of public recognition and support. And we shouldn't include a citizenry that is, brainwashed, and is, inside of a country that's running essentially one great big prison state, national gulag. Having said that, we also have three types. You've seen this in the book, but we have three categories of legitimacy. All right, what are those? Rational, legal. So inside of rational, we could just say democratic, because what we're including inside of rational, legal legitimacy are democratic regimes where there's an open enough election, and that in itself constitutes legitimacy. So the United States would have legitimacy, rational, legal legitimacy, or any particular leader inside of a democratic government would be considered legitimate based upon that. Okay? All right, there are exceptions, but that's rational, legal. Okay? Traditional legitimacy. Basically, we're talking about traditional forms of government, aristocracies and the like. The old aristocracies, the monarchies, they had legitimacy because they had a certain system. The citizens understood that system. The citizens approved of it to one extent or another. And so monarchies have traditional legitimacy. Any previous, original, traditional form of government would be considered to either not be legitimate or to have traditional legitimacy. And then the last category is a little bit different. Charismatic. We have to be careful about that word, but this is where ideology is involved, and oftentimes one or just a few leaders who encompass or personify that ideology. That is considered charismatic legitimacy. Now, so be careful here, because you can be a charismatic person who has a different form of legitimacy. President Ronald Reagan was often considered charismatic by a lot of people, but that wasn't charismatic legitimacy, that was rational, legal legitimacy. And then some people that would have charismatic legitimacy might not be considered charismatic at all. All right. What's included here? Ideologies. Communism. Communist leaders had charismatic legitimacy. Um, so people like Lenin and Stalin and the like, Castro in Cuba, that sort of thing. Other ideologies, theocracies. So in Iran, there's charismatic legitimacy there. Ideology based upon an interpretation of a faith. That would be considered charismatic legitimacy. Some other leaders here and there, Gaddafi in Libya, we might be sensing a pattern that these are all sort of authoritarians. Yes, legitimacy is not the end all in whether or not something is good or worthwhile or needs to be replaced. It's just this idea of to what extent does the public support that regime? To what extent is the public okay with that regime? And a lot of times you can't really know. So legitimacy is a little tough, but I'll leave it at that. The next concept is extremely important, and you definitely want to make sure you're comfortable with the book here. Decentralization. How centralized is your state? So centralization versus decentralization. And essentially, we've got a few types. Okay. The most centralized forms of states are what we call unitary states. And most states are unitary states around the globe. These tend to be geographically small. They tend to be ethnically homogeneous, relatively ethnically homogeneous. So countries where there's not many ethnic groups and are not very large tend to be unitary states, which means they have one national government and everybody has to obey those orders. There's no local or regional sharing of power. That's what we mean by centralized. The power is centrally located in one organization, usually geographically located too, in the capital city. Examples is almost everybody. One group of examples would be the small little micro-states and the island nations, 50, 60, there's roughly 190 some modern states. 50, 60 of them are very small geographically. A lot of those are island nations. Those are all unitary. Japan, still very relatively homogeneous in terms of ethnicity and geographically a fairly small state. That's a good example. Larger and less ethnically homogeneous. France, that's a centralized state. That's a unitary state. So who's not unitary? What do we call them? We call them federal systems. Okay, so a lot of times you'll hear people say the United States is a federal republic. It's not a democracy. Okay, let's not make too much of that. There are a lot of federal states. The U.S. is not the only one. They tend to be more ethnically diverse, and they tend to be geographically larger. The United States is a federal system. Mexico is a federal system that has states as the subunit, estados. What are some other large countries? Well, let's actually skip to the subcategory, asymmetrically federal states. So this is a federal state as just described, but where one or more regions, maybe it's a province, maybe it's a state, you get the point. One or more regions has a little bit extra autonomy because they're probably a minority ethnicity. Where we go back to ethnicity, again coming up in chapter 3, which you'll get to watch me talk about over the weekend. So, what are some examples of this? Canada is a asymmetrically federal state. It's a federal state just like the U.S. in a lot of ways, but Quebec is a region within Quebec that has extra autonomy because it is traditionally French as opposed to English speaking. So they have a little bit more power to make their own decisions in Quebec. The UK is asymmetrically federal. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland all have a little extra autonomy. Scotland has especially been gaining more autonomy over the last 10, 15 years. 20, 25 years probably. Russia, very large, definitely a federal system. It's asymmetrical in some of their regions, Chechnya, for example, that are majority Muslim rather than Orthodox Christian. They have different rules. Iraq is asymmetrically federal system. This constitution given to them by the West, by the U.S. Invading armies, gave the Kurds in the north extra autonomy. Again, different ethnicity. We've already mentioned the Kurds. Okay, so that's centralization versus decentralization. Which one is better? Who knows, right? But hopefully you can see the reason why most states are unitary is because the national government can be unitary. They don't have to distribute power. They can maintain it all. Why? Because there's not too much ethnic conflict, and the geography is not that enormous. Federalism can be a potential solution to ethnic struggles, ethnic conflicts. Famously here, Ethiopia is a very controversial federal system that's intended to address the fact that there's a lot of ethnicities in Ethiopia and a lot of traditional conflict. And so it's an attempt to basically take a large, difficult to rule country and make it a little bit more manageable to rule. So that's decentralization, or the concept of centralization itself. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, there's a little bit about this in the book, but I find it very useful, is state effectiveness. Are states effective or not? Well, how do we talk about that? The way we talk about it traditionally is in strong versus weak. But more recently, extra dimensions have been added. And you see this in the book. Instead of just talking about like one line, strong versus weak, we now have a table with two axes. And one is capacity and the other is autonomy. So you can have a state that has high autonomy and high capacity, or high autonomy, low capacity, or low autonomy, high capacity, or low autonomy, low capacity. Well, what do these mean? Capacity just means the capability to do stuff. The US is high capacity. China is high capacity. Germany is high capacity. These states are effective. They can do a lot of things. Not necessarily effective, but they can do a lot of things. They have a lot of abilities. They can tax their citizens. They can manufacture things. They can help their economies. They can help their citizens. They can distribute goods, etc. That's capacity. Autonomy is the ability to make and enact decisions. And guess what? Democracies are low autonomy. Why? Because of the damn people, the citizens. Everything has to go through the citizens, so it can take a long time. When you talk about the concept of gridlock in democracies, just the system being stuck, nothing can move, well, this is because the citizens ultimately get to decide, and they may not be able to agree. Whereas in a place like China, which has high autonomy, the national government can make decisions relatively quickly In China, they have high capacity too, so they can make decisions and they can implement them. So that, in some ways, uh, that's would be overall a very strong state. Democracies are hindered by their ability to um, get things moving, to make those decisions. Non-democracies don't have that problem, but a lot of non-democracies aren't very effective or capable either. Unfortunately, this is not a happy ending. It's a gloomy story. The vast majority of countries would probably be best placed in the worst category, which is low capacity, low autonomy. Democracies that just are not very capable. Um, and I'll end it. I'll end the snippet on that very sad, dark, depressing note. And I will see you for the next snippet.